All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Wednesday prayer meeting Bible study time. Glad that you've tuned in. If you're tuning in this afternoon live, or if you're going to be watching this later on, we're glad that you're joining us for this time of Bible study together. We're in 1 Timothy. The mail out that was sent today did not include the notes that have been sent the last 2 weeks. If you're receiving that email, then you've had those notes, and there's no sense in sending it out again to you. So we are looking at chapter 3 in 1 Timothy, and we'll pick up with that part of our study today. Before we do that, let me say to any who might be watching on YouTube, this Sunday we're having our choir presentation, cantata. We'd love for you to come and be a part of that worship service. It's not an entertainment. It is a proclamation through song of the gospel story. And we invite you to come, bring a friend, be a part of that service. Special time of worship coming up this Sunday during the worship service. We invite you to that. We also invite you to our Christmas Eve service, the 24th at 5:30 here in the sanctuary. We will have the service as we normally do, which includes the singing of favorite carols, of course, the reading of the Christmas story, the birth of Jesus, a sermon, and then followed by communion and our candlelight benediction. We sing Silent Night together, the last thing we do, and then we have a little responsive reading that we engage in with the candles here in the darkened sanctuary. So would love for you to come and be a part of that service. It's always a special time to be together. Often have a lot of family here for that service. We invite you to come and be a part of that service and bring somebody with you the right way, the good way, an appropriate way for us to begin to celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve. So we are looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3. And before we start reading the text, I've got in my notes just kind of a primer on how we as Baptists look at the leadership in the church. When you read the New Testament, you will see primarily two words used that are translated in particular ways. The Greek word episkopos is translated bishop. It's translated in the text that we have before us from the New Revised Standard Version. The other word that is used is presbyteros. That sounds like Presbyterian, and that's exactly where they took it from. It's translated as elder. And so you see those two words used. Debate, certainly within different church traditions, about whether those are two separate offices or whether those words are used interchangeably. We as Baptists look at those two words in the same fashion, and we interpret those words with our word pastor. And so whenever we see the word episkopos or the word presbyteros in the text, we read pastor. We think of the chief officer in the life of the church. For Baptists, there are two offices primarily. Generally, there are some Baptists that do have elders too, but primarily in Southern Baptist life, the two offices are the office of pastor and the office of deacon. We're reading about both of those offices here today. A quick review of what we understand those offices to have to do with. For Baptists, the pastor is the under shepherd of the great shepherd. Jesus is the great shepherd of his people. All in the church belong to Jesus Christ, and he is the shepherd of the church. He is the head of the church. The pastor is an appointed office holder, appointed by Christ to practice shepherding in the church. That shepherding consisting of such tasks as watching over the spiritual welfare of the church, teaching the way of Jesus, warning the believers about sin and helping them to know how to live the life of faith in the world, extending a ministry of care and concern for people and helping them to understand their trials and tribulations within the context of the faith. These are all aspects of pastoral ministry. We add to that, of course, administrative capacities in pastoral work, but that's kind of how we look and think about and talk about pastors as the key as a key leadership office in the church. The office of deacon is the other office in the church. Baptists have a lot of different understandings of what deacons are supposed to do. Part of the problem for us is that there's no job description list in the New Testament, either for the pastor, the bishop or elder, and there's no job description list for the deacon. We have some hints and clues about what each are to do, but we have to extrapolate from those clues to kind of fill out that larger picture. So Acts 6 is the passage that speaks to the initiation of the deacon office. In that particular moment, the church, the leaders in the church, the apostles, were focused on the ministry of the word and prayer, and they were having to give some of their time and attention to the distribution of the funds of the church to help the poor. And they wanted the church to appoint special leaders to take care of the needs of the needy in the church. And that's where in Acts 6 we have the first ordaining of officers to deal with the material needs of people in the church. So that's what Acts 6 focuses on. And as a result of that, many times the work of the deacon has to do with caring for the poor or the needy in the church or outside the church. But other things have been added to it. The deacons being seen as assistants to the pastor and the work of the church, and will take up other tasks, assistance in worship, assistance in pastoral care, preparation of candidates for baptism, the elements of the Lord's Supper. The deacons often will take the elements to the congregation, and so the deacon office includes many of these types of functions. In the past 50 years or so, Baptists have tried to emphasize the ministry aspect of the deacon office, and have incorporated the family deacon ministry model. Just about every Baptist church I know of has embraced that at some point in time, and has either held on to it or has moved on to some other model. So every Baptist church will have a different sort of function for the deacon body. It'll range from the deacons as kind of the administrators of the church, handling finances or handling secular affairs related to the church, all the way down to deacon family ministry. It's kind of a catch-all office in the life and ministry of the church. Back to the pastoral office, and just to help us kind of understand a little bit, as we talked about before, in the local churches, in the towns where the churches were located, they didn't have the big church building like we do. Rather, the churches met in the homes of individual members of the church. And so in a home, you would have a smaller grouping of people, 10 to 20 people probably. And so in these passages in the New Testament, we'll see elder referred to in the plural. There are elders in the church. And that refers to the individual kind of little pastors over the individual church homes. And so in Ephesus, Timothy seems to be kind of what we would call a bishop in our day, with elders. He's kind of ruling over all the elders in the church in Ephesus, but the other elders would have been the individual leaders in those home church cells. Today you might think in some churches they have small group ministries where big large churches in big cities will have Bible study groups that meet in homes all across the vast expanse of the city, and so whoever's leading those groups, the cell group, there'll be a leader, and there will be somebody on staff who's overseeing them, and that's kind of the model that seems to be in play here in Ephesus and in other places. But the use of the term elders in the plural just means that there are various pastors in those various home churches in that particular town. Indeed, First Peter 5. I've referenced First Peter 5 and Acts 20. Peter writing to the elders in the churches that he's overseeing. Now, as an elder myself, and as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as one who shares in the glory to be revealed, I exhort the elders among you. And we don't know what town, what congregation Peter was dealing with here, but the elders among you, that is the local leaders in those house churches, to tend the flock of God that is in your charge, exercising the oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you do it, not for sordid gain, but eagerly. You'll see some of this come to the fore in the passage we're reading in 1 Timothy here. Do not lord it over those in your charge, but be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will win the crown of glory that never fades away. So you see in that passage some of what we're talking about. The pastor, the elder, the bishop, whatever you want to call him, is an under shepherd to the great shepherd and has charge of a particular flock. In the church in that day, they would have been individual house churches in that larger congregation. In Acts 20, Paul actually talks to the elders in Ephesus before he leaves. This is before he's written this letter to Timothy. In Acts chapter 20, verse 17, Luke writes, from Miletus, he sent a message to Ephesus asking the elders of the church to meet him. That is, Paul has written to them and asked for them to meet him. When they came to him, he said to them, you yourselves know how I lived among you the entire time from the first day that I set foot in Asia, serving the Lord with all humility and with tears, enduring the trials that came to me through the plots of the Jews. Goes on and talk about it. And now, verse 22, now as a captive of the whole, to the Spirit, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. And so he's saying goodbye. This is his goodbye scene. Verse 25, and now I know that none of you among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom will ever see my face again. Therefore I declare to you this day that I'm not responsible for the blood of any of you, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. That is, he exercised proper leadership over them, made sure that they were on task as best he could. Verse 28, keep watch over yourselves and over all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God that he obtained with the blood of his own Son. I know that after I am gone, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Some even from your own group will come, distorting the truth in order to entice the disciples to follow them. Paul is speaking to the elders in Ephesus. This is before Timothy's time, and he's calling them to be diligent in their work, and he's warning them that they'll be tempted to go astray and to lead the church astray. And that's exactly what has happened. That's exactly why Timothy has been charged to stay here and to exercise authority over these elders. So Timothy is kind of a overseeing elder. He oversees all the other elders. And this is a model that's been embraced by other church traditions, the Methodist, the Episcopal Church. You have an oversight bishop with pastors working in the local congregations. For Baptist, again, we don't have that. We see the individual pastor in individual church exercising the same type of ministry that Timothy had, and making sure that in the church, all who have responsibility for teaching or ministering are following through in their work accordingly. Okay, that's a whole lot of stuff, but it helps, I think, always to drive home the point, because you're going to hear the term bishop and all that kind of stuff. And so when you hear the term bishop or you hear the term elder, think pastor. If you're a Baptist, that'll work well. And that's how we have understood it in times past. What we have here in 1 Timothy 3 is not a job description. It is a character list. It's a list of characteristics that ought to be found in the leaders. For Paul, it's not as important to talk about what they're supposed to do. Evidently, that was obvious to them. What was important was for them to know what kind of persons they were supposed to be. The key issue for leadership is what kinds of persons these leaders are. Number one, are they true Christians? And number two, are they living out the faith before others? All right, so we go to the text. The saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of bishop desires a noble task. Now, a bishop must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, an apt teacher, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil. We'll stop right there. The bishop is the first one. The word to the deacons is very similar. It's going to repeat some of the same themes, even as it adds some things to it. But we're talking about the pastors in the church at this particular point. Starts off, those who aspire to the office of bishop desire noble task. We Baptists believe that that ministers in the church are to be called to ministry in the church. This doesn't negate that sense of things. Those who are called to ministry in the church aspire to fulfilling that calling in the church. And Paul is just saying that's a great and noble task. And indeed it is. The church is about the salvation of individuals, which includes, as we talked about on Sunday, not only making a profession of faith, but of living into the fullness of Jesus Christ. You're saved in order that you might grow into holiness. And that's the work of the church. And that work is under the sponsorship of the pastor. The pastor is to make sure that people are aspiring to full Christ-likeness. Paul talks about this in another place, one of my favorite passages in Colossians chapter 1. Near the end of chapter 1, he writes, it is Christ whom we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone in all wisdom, so that we may present everyone mature in Christ. The pastor's job is not just to get them in the church, but to get them growing up into the fullness of Jesus Christ. Salvation is about confessing faith and then growing into all righteousness. And so it's a high calling, a noble calling, a difficult calling. So Paul extols the office to start with, and then he says, now a bishop must be above reproach. If it's going to be a high calling, then the person who's going to take it on had better be a high character type of person. So they must be above reproach. Married only once. Here's the issue that has been talked about in Baptist life forever and ever, amen. And it's a phrase that's hard to get a final, clear understanding on. I've given you in the notes several possible ways of understanding this phrase. The phrase actually rendered literally is a man of one woman or a one-woman man. That's what literally comes out if you take the Greek into English. Married once is literally a man of one woman or a one-woman man. And it can be understood in several ways. It can be understood as being married, first of all. There is in the church the teaching against marriage. It's a call to a very ascetical sort of life, a life of denial all across the front. So some see in it a call to be married. The pastors ought to be married. There's some church traditions wouldn't agree with that, but that's one way of possibly understanding this phrase, a man of one woman or a one-woman man. Another way of saying it is that it means being married to only one person or one person at a time. Polygamy was an issue in ancient church days, in the culture, the surrounding culture, and also in the larger culture, being married but having a mistress was also acceptable, normal behavior in the Greco-Roman world. And so the call here is to be married to one person at a time, to be married to only one person. It could be read that way. It could be read as married only once, so that if you were divorced or you had suffered the death of a spouse, that you should not get married again. You should only be married to one woman your whole life. That's another way of reading it. We don't know that that is the way you should read it, per se, but that's one way of reading that phrase. Another way of what we've been talking about. Of course, it can be read as never divorced. And that's always been the big issue in Baptist church life, and we've gone round and round on that and discussed that. And a lot of people will appeal to this particular passage for that, and that's a possible reading here, but it's not the necessary reading here. There are multiple ways of reading it as we're bringing to light here. And then again, faithful to your spouse, which goes back to talking about not polygamous or not having extra marital relationships with others. Married to only one person. So you can again, people have made all sorts of arguments in all sorts of directions, and if you're trying to argue from the text, you can go in those different directions, with fair justification. And Baptist churches have debated that and come to various conclusions, and we, as this church, have done that as well. Hold it within the larger context. Wherever you are, however you understand that, are you respectably married at this moment? Are you being the spouse that you're supposed to be to your partner? Are you engaged in a Christian marriage? Boil it down to that. Are you faithfully married to the person who is your spouse at that moment? For me, that's kind of boil it all down to that. Wherever you are, whatever you've come through, wherever you're at the moment, are you faithfully married to this person right now? If you're going to be a leader in the church, you better, be engaged in marriage in the holy fashion. Temperate, sensible, respectable, somebody who is self-controlled, somebody who is not given to, wild flights of fancy and unstable, going this direction all the time, going that direction all the time, switching gears fast, doing things in a dignified sort of way, maintaining the dignity of the office. Again, the office of pastor, the under shepherd to the great shepherd. That person should be somebody who, is trying to live the life of faith completely, is walking the way of Christ, is not being pulled this way and that by all sorts of other things, but is very steady in his or her work for the Lord. Hospitable, we talked about that on occasion. The early church, hospitality was a great concern in the early church, as it was in Israel. Caring for the stranger, caring for the person who is in the community, by accident or by necessity, and extending God's grace to those. The pastor should, help the church extend a ministry of hospitality to those in need. An apt teacher. Teaching is such an important aspect of what the pastor does, the bishop, the elder. The teaching office of the church is so significant. Again, salvation is not just about professing faith and then taking a seat on the train and waiting for you to get all the way to heaven. Salvation is about growing in the way of Jesus Christ. The Great Commission, tells us to go into all the world, preaching the gospel and baptizing those who receive Christ as Savior, and then teaching them everything that I have commanded you. Teaching them everything. It's right in the Great Commission. We always look right over it. One of my favorite authors wrote that part of the Great Commission has been omitted, and so he calls it the Great Omission, teaching the disciples. That's central to the life of the church. That's central to what's going on in Ephesus at this time. There are false teachers in the church. They're teaching errant doctrine. And so everything is messed up. And so teaching, so very significant. Other translations will say not just apt teacher, but diligent, faithful, skilled teacher. Not a drunkard. Well, that kind of goes without saying, right? And we wonder, why we do ever have to do that, because we're good Baptists and we don't drink. Well, but remember the day and age. Drinking wine was like drinking water. Matter of fact, it was better than drinking water in the ancient world. The water sources weren't always good, and you'll find Paul telling Timothy or one of the others, I can't remember who, a little way to run to make sure he drinks a little bit of wine that will settle his stomach. And so we know Paul got after the church at Corinth because some of them had been getting drunk at the meals. Their celebration of the Lord's Supper was in the midst of their eating together, and some were eating before everybody else did, and they were getting drunk. Not a good scene. So the temptation to get drunk, to drink too much, certainly was present in that world, as it's not necessarily present in our little Baptist world today. And so it was an issue of concern. Again, self-control being the main thing. Not violent, but gentle. Again, self-control. Not quarrelsome. There's something to be said there that ought to be said, because I've known too many quarrelsome types who are ministers. We really ought to hold our folks to that more than we do, I think. You've got to be able to not... everybody gets angry and everybody gets involved in sticky situations, but there are some who seem to be good at doing that. And if you are good at doing that, then you need to check that somehow. Have somebody keep a check on you, or whatever you need to do. But that leads to trouble in church life. It's so easy for us to get distracted by conflicts. And if the pastor is good at stirring up stuff, then that's a recipe for trouble. And there are too many churches, you all know of churches where the pastors have been the leaders in stirring up stuff. Not a lover of money. There's evidently, that's an issue in the church in Ephesus at this time. Paul's going to talk about this in chapter 6. The love of money is the root of all evil. Did you know that that's in 1 Timothy chapter 6? You all know it's biblical, but did you know that that's where it's located? The last part of chapter 6 talks about the love of money, and evidently there was some teaching in the church who were doing it for money in some way or another. They were lovers of money. The pastor cannot be, again, it's about self-control. If money is what motivates you, then there's something wrong there. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? Again, the church was meeting in the houses, and they saw themselves as a family, as a household. And so that image is very rich for the early believers. And again, the pastor, the bishop, is expected to be able to exercise good management of the household, to do so at home, because the same kinds of expectations, same kinds of needs will be found in the life of the church. This goes back to not being quarrelsome, to being temperate and sensible and respectable. It's like Andy Griffith, I've told y'all before. What I love about Andy Griffith is he's the pastor of Mayberry, and he knows everybody's weaknesses and their strengths, and he tries to help them be their best selves, while keeping things kind of in control and keeping them moving forward. And that's really not a bad image for a pastor. As the pastor comes to learn the flock and know the flock, the pastor understands where the fault lines are, and where some of our weaknesses are and our strengths, and tries to help us navigate those types of things. That's part of managing the household of the church. Making sure everybody gets heard, making sure everything gets done on the up and up. That kind of thing. Verse 6, he must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. More so with deacons than with pastors is this a problem. We will oftentimes try, if we see some young, man or woman who, looks like a good faithful church member, has been in the church only for a little while, and we think, boy, they'd make a great deacon. And so we just rush them on in there. Let's get them to be a deacon. And that's a good impulse, but we need to be careful about that. He talks about the deacons. They need to be tested in other ways. Same thing with the pastor. They need to have some spiritual maturity to them. You're going to have them exercising leadership over the household of God. And so they can't be a recent convert. The ego will take hold and will do horrible, terrible things. I've told you again and again, and I mean it, ego is one of the main demons that pastors deal with. Anybody who stands up and preaches the gospel or leads in Christ's church, the temptation to let it go to your head is huge. And it's always in little small ways that you're giving in and falling to it. And so if you're a recent convert, you're especially susceptible to that. This is one of the problems with the way we do things in church life, and I've heard this talked about in many different places. But all the country churches, all the poor little country churches, they always get the people right out of seminary, right? And it's a money thing, it's an experience thing, and so those poor little country churches. And you know what? I had a poor little country church that had to deal with me. However bad I am now, I was much worse way back then. And poor Providence Church in Red House, Virginia. You have just enough knowledge to be dangerous, and so it's really to put somebody fresh out of seminary as a pastor of a church. It's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing, and it's not because those people are bad. It's just there's so much to leadership in the church, and there's so much temptation when you're the representative of Christ to a body of people. There's so much temptation for ego to just take over, and so we really ought to have a better system. When I came out of Southern Seminary, as a matter of fact, they had what was it? It was a program where you would go to a church and you served as kind of a resident minister. You did something on staff, but you were kind of learning how to be a minister in the church. It was a pastoral residency program or something like that. And I did that for Farmville Baptist. I was there for 2 years, and it was a planned kind of experience where I got to learn all about pastoral ministry and experience in the church. And so, fortunately, I didn't go straight to Providence Church right out of seminary. I had 2 years at Farmville Baptist as an associate minister, learning some of the ropes and figuring out a few things. So I wasn't nearly as bad as I could have been, had I not had that experience. And I think we need to do more of those kinds of things. There's some churches that, are very good and intentional about having those kind of internships where they take recent seminary graduates and they try to help them, learn the ropes so that when they do go into their first churches, they can do so more prepared. The last thing, he must be well thought of by outsiders. We shouldn't take that too literally in the sense that, we got to make sure that the people in town think your pastor is a good person or not. We want that, of course, but that's, people out there don't have a notion of what pastors are supposed to be like all the time, and they base their observations of things on other factors. The gist of this is that the pastor is a good representative of the faith to the community. When the people in the community look at the pastor, they see someone who is practicing the faith with integrity, so that the pastor is witnessing by example as much, as by his knowledge or her exercise of abilities in the church. And so, being thought of well by outsiders, being judged to be people of integrity is important. Generally for the church, but also specifically for the leadership in the church. That goes for deacons as well. We're going to stop with that. We'll talk about the deacons next week. Any of y'all's thoughts or comments or questions about any of that? Anything that you want to go back and look at? All right. Well, we'll pick up next week and finish off with the deacons and finish off the end of the chapter 3 next Wednesday when we come together. Thank you much for joining us today, and pray God's blessings upon you for the remainder of this week.